In the late 1970s, a Soviet delegation toured an American aircraft plant. Polite men, approved itinerary, escorts the whole way. One of them had put adhesive on the soles of his shoes. He walked the factory floor, shook hands, smiled, and flew home to Moscow, carrying metal shavings off an American production line, because the alloy itself was something his country could not yet make. That is the level we are working at. Not a briefcase of documents in a Vienna hotel. A man stealing the floor. For most of the Cold War, the West knew this was happening and could not measure it. They caught individual thieves. They never saw the organization behind them, or the size of it, or what it was actually shopping for. Then a colonel inside the KGB unit that ran the whole operation photographed close to 4,000 of its own documents and handed them to France. Not a rumor. Not a fragment. The inventory. Everything Moscow had already taken. Everything it still needed and could not build. And 250 names. His code name was Farewell. In the next half hour, you will get the full file. What was on that list? What Washington decided to do with it? Why the most famous part of this story, the one about an explosion in Siberia, may never have happened at all, and how the man who started it destroyed himself in a parked car over something that had nothing to do with espionage. Start with the machine he betrayed. In 1970, the Soviet leadership created a new arm of the KGB and gave it a single assignment. It was called Directorate T. Its job was Western science and technology, not political secrets, not diplomatic gossip. Blueprints, specifications, working samples. Its operating arm was called Line X, and Line X was not a handful of officers. By the early 80s, it had roughly 250 people working abroad under legal cover. Embassies, trade missions, scientific delegations in cities across the Western world. Think about that number for a second, because most spy stories involve one or two people. 250, salaried, housed, accredited, working a quota. Now the obvious question: why did the Soviet Union, a state that put the first satellite and the first man into orbit, need a permanent theft bureau? Because by the 70s, the contest had changed shape. The early Cold War was decided by things you could build with enormous effort and mediocre precision. Rockets, warheads, tanks, steel and mass and will, and the Soviet system was genuinely good at steel and mass and will. Then the whole race moved into the one domain that system could not force: microelectronics, semiconductors, machine tools accurate to a fraction of a hair, computers, and the software that ran them. Those things do not come from central planning and heroic effort. They come from thousands of small firms competing, failing, iterating, and being allowed to fail, which is precisely the mechanism the Soviet economy had been designed to eliminate. Soviet scientists were not the problem. Soviet physicists were world-class, and everyone in Washington knew it. The problem was everything between a good idea and a mass-produced component. So Moscow made a decision that tells you exactly how the leadership saw its own position. If it could not manufacture the future on schedule, it would acquire the future on schedule. And it worked. That is the part nobody enjoys saying out loud. Radar, machine tools, computers, semiconductors. Whole categories of Soviet capability existed because that capability had first existed in the West and then been bought, copied, or lifted, which produced a very strange dependency at the center of a superpower. The Soviet Union was not simply competing with the West. In several critical areas, it was downstream of the West, waiting on it, and nobody in Washington could prove it. Analysts suspected. They had fragments, a suspicious purchase in Vienna, a prototype that went missing in Hamburg, an accredited trade official who kept turning up at the same laboratory. You could build one case at a time, slowly, in the dark. What nobody had was the shape of the thing, until a man whose entire job was to see that shape decided he had seen enough of it. Vladimir Ippolitovich Vetrov was born in 1932. He studied electronic engineering, and the KGB recruited him out of that world. Not from the political side, not from the security side, but from the technical side. Which mattered because it determined the desk he eventually sat at. In the 60s, he was posted to Paris. He worked undercover in France for years, and while he was there, he did something ordinary that would matter enormously 2 decades later. He made a friend. A French businessman named Jacques Prévost from the world of French electronics, the kind of contact a Line X officer is supposed to cultivate. They liked each other. The friendship survived Vetrov's return to Moscow. Hold on to him. He is the door this whole story eventually walks through, because by the late 70s, Vetrov was back in Moscow, and his job had changed from collecting to evaluating. Understand what that means, because it is the single most important fact in this story. Vetrov did not run agents in the field. He sat inside Directorate T and read what the field produced. Every request that came up from Soviet industry and the Soviet military. We need this component. We cannot make this alloy. Our people cannot produce this circuit. Crossed his desk. Every report that came back from Line X officers abroad acquired this. Failed to acquire that, this target is still open. Crossed his desk. He was the point where the wish and the theft met on paper. Now put yourself in that chair for 10 years. An ordinary Soviet citizen in 1980 could believe the official story because nothing in daily life definitively disproved it. The Union was catching up. The gap was closing. History was on their side. Vetrov could not believe it. He was reading the counter-evidence 8 hours a day, filed and stamped. He knew precisely which parts of Soviet military power were imported. He knew which laboratories were waiting on a shipment from a country they were officially preparing to fight. He knew the future his state kept promising was being quietly ordered from the enemy. There is a specific kind of damage that does to a person, and it is not the same as ordinary disillusionment. It is the damage of being the only one in the room holding the receipts. At the end of 1980, Vetrov made contact. Not with the Americans. That is worth pausing on, and we will come back to why it mattered. He reached his old friend Prévost, and through him, French counterintelligence, the DST. And here is the detail that tells you the French understood exactly what they had just been handed. They needed a code name for him. They chose an English word, farewell, deliberately. Because if the KGB ever caught a fragment of that code name in traffic, an English word would point at London or Washington, and the hunt would start in the wrong country. They were already protecting him before he had given them anything. One more thing about Vetrov, and it is the thing that keeps historians arguing to this day. He never asked for money. No payments, no account in Zurich, no promise of a house in the West when it was over, which removes the easiest explanation and leaves you with the hard one. That a colonel inside the KGB looked at the machine he served, decided it was a lie, and chose to break it for nothing. Sergei Kostin, who wrote the definitive book on him, argues for something less noble and more human. Professional resentment, a capable man passed over in an institution that ran on connections. Both readings fit the same man. Neither is confirmed, because Vetrov left no clean statement of motive. What he left instead was the file. From the spring of 1981 to the beginning of 1982, Vetrov photographed and passed out close to 4,000 documents. He did it while staying at his desk, which is a distinction most people miss. A defector runs. He crosses a border, asks for asylum, and from that moment he is a former officer, valuable but frozen. Whatever he knew as of the day he left. A source who stays is live. He keeps producing, and he is exposed every single hour of every single day, because the material he is stealing is the material he is officially responsible for. Every report he touched, he could be photographing. Every request he processed, he could be copying. And he had to keep being, convincingly, the loyal officer whose signature was on all of it. What came out of that year was not intelligence in the usual sense. It was an inventory. Summary reports from Directorate T itself, goals, achievements, and most valuable of all, unfulfilled objectives. What the program had gotten, what it had failed to get, what it needed next. Target lists in electronics, computers, and machine tools. And the roster. Roughly 250 Line X officers working under legal cover worldwide. Now, the DST is a domestic counterintelligence service. This material was not domestic. It described a global operation running against every advanced economy in the Western Alliance, most of all against the United States. So the question landed on the desk of a French president who had been in office for a matter of weeks. François Mitterrand had just won the presidency in May 1981, and he had done it with communist ministers in his coalition. Washington did not trust him. There was open discussion in Reagan's circle about whether France could still be told anything sensitive at all. And into that atmosphere, Mitterrand walked up to Ronald Reagan at the Economic Summit in Ottawa in July 1981 and told him, personally, that French intelligence had a source inside Soviet technical intelligence, and that France would share what he was producing. Read the room he was standing in. He had a French asset, a French recruitment, and a once-in-a-generation intelligence coup, and he gave it away in his first summer in office. Some of that was alliance politics. Some of it was a man buying credibility he had not yet earned. The material reached the Americans, and eventually it reached a specific person on the National Security Council staff, an economist named Gus Weiss, who had spent years arguing that Soviet technology theft was a strategic problem and had spent years being treated as an obsessive. He opened the file and found a decade of his own argument, written in Russian by the KGB. And now here is a twist that almost nobody includes when they tell this story. By 1985, Mitterrand had turned suspicious of his own source. He came to wonder whether Vetrov had been a plant all along, an operation aimed not at the Soviet Union, but at him. A test. A gift dangled in front of a new French president with communists in his cabinet, to see whether he would hand it to Washington or keep it for Paris. There is no evidence he was right, but it tells you what this world does to the people inside it. The most successful intelligence operation of the late Cold War landed in Mitterrand's hands, and 4 years later, he was still turning it over, looking for the hook. Meanwhile, in Washington, the file had produced a question with only 2 possible answers. You are holding the names of 250 hostile officers and a list of everything their government is trying to buy, copy, and steal. You can do one of 2 things. You can close the pipe, expose the officers, expel them, shut the network down, and accept that Moscow will spend the next decade rebuilding it. Or you can leave the pipe open and decide what flows through it. That second option only exists because of what the dossier proved about dependency. If Soviet programs were building on Western technology, they had acquired covertly, technology they could not fully validate, could not send back, could not complain about. then the quality of Soviet technology was partly in American hands. You would not have to attack it. You would only have to let it be taken. According to the account CIA Director William Casey's staff later gave, that is the option they chose, and Reagan approved it in early 1982. Not instead of the expulsions, before them. Hold that sequence, because everything contested about this story lives inside it. The expulsions themselves are not contested. They are on the public record, and they were brutal. France moved on the 5th of April 1983 and expelled 47 Soviet officials in a single stroke, one of the largest such expulsions in the history of the alliance. And France was not alone. Allied services moved across multiple countries using the same roster. Coordinating that is harder than it sounds. Move against one officer and you warn the rest. Move against all of them at once, and you need governments in several capitals agreeing on timing, sharing a list, and accepting a risk none of them can fully see. You are also spending your source. Every officer you expel is a signal to Moscow that someone gave you the roster. They did it anyway, which tells you how much they valued the disruption over the continued access. Now stand inside Directorate T and watch it happen. The reports stop. An officer is declared persona non grata in Paris, then another in a different capital, then a cluster, then 47 at once. Networks that took 15 years to build are gone in 18 months, and the pattern is far too broad and too precise to be counter-surveillance luck. Someone has the list, which means the breach is not at the edge of the organization. It is at the center, in the small number of rooms where the whole picture exists in one place. Vetrov was sitting in one of those rooms. But this is where the story does something almost no spy story does, and it is the reason we are not at the ending yet. The mole hunt did not find him. Before we get to how he was actually caught, we have to deal with the famous part. Because if you have heard of the Farewell Dossier at all, you have probably heard one thing, and it is not 250 officers or 47 expulsions. It is an explosion. In 2004, Thomas C. Reed, a former Secretary of the Air Force who served on Reagan's National Security Council, published a memoir called At the Abyss. In it, he described what the farewell material had made possible. The Soviets, he wrote, were building an enormous natural gas pipeline out of the Urengoy fields in Siberia to carry gas to Western Europe. It was a strategic project. It would earn billions in hard currency every year, and it would make Western Europe dependent on Soviet energy, which is why Washington had been fighting the project politically for years. To run it, the Soviets needed sophisticated control software for the pumps, turbines, and valves. Software they could not legally buy. So, Reed wrote, they stole it from a Canadian firm, exactly the way the farewell list said they would. And the Americans, knowing in advance what the Soviets were coming for, made sure the software they got had been altered. It would run correctly for a while. Then, after a decent interval, it would begin resetting pump speeds and valve settings to pressures far beyond what the pipeline's welds and joints could hold. In the summer of 1982, according to Reed, it did exactly that, producing a fireball in the Siberian wilderness so large it was picked up by American early warning satellites and briefly mistaken for something far worse. It is an extraordinary story, a perfect story. The theft turned into the delivery mechanism, the victim writing the weapon. The Cold War won with a logic bomb, 20 years before anyone used the phrase. And it spread everywhere, into serious histories, into policy books, into cybersecurity training slides that are still in use. So let us do what almost nobody does with it, and check. Start with the region. In 2004, a reporter reached Vasily Pechelintsev, who in 1982 ran the KGB office in Tyumen, the territory where Reed's explosion would have occurred. His assessment of the American account was blunt and unprintable in polite form. What he remembered was a different incident entirely. A rupture that spring, roughly 50 kilometers from Tobolsk, when the ground thawed and shifted the pipes. No sabotage, no casualties, nothing remotely resembling the fireball in the book. Next, the press. A pipeline explosion the size Reed described would have been one of the largest non-nuclear detonations ever recorded, in a region Western correspondents watched closely. Search the New York Times archive across the months it supposedly happened, and there is nothing. Ordinary Soviet pipeline accidents were being reported in that period. This one was not. Next, the engineering. A Soviet specialist who worked on pipeline safety in that era has said flatly that Soviet gas pipelines of the period were not run by the kind of computer control Reed's story requires, and that the yield he described is not physically consistent with the pipeline in question. Next, the CIA. The agency declassified Gus Weiss's own account of the operation in 1996 and published it. So the program is not a secret. And in all of that, the agency has never confirmed the explosion. Nicholas Dujmovich, who worked on the CIA's own history staff, has gone further and described the pipeline sabotage story as a persistent myth. The political scientist Thomas Rid examined the evidence and concluded it was too thin and questionable to count as a proven case. The historian David Painter reached the same place from a different direction. There was a CIA program to corrupt stolen software, and there was a pipeline explosion in Siberia in 1982, and there is no independent evidence linking the two. And then there is the piece of this that stops you cold. In 2010, a journalist asked Thomas Reed directly whether he believed the pipeline account he had published. Reed's answer, "I don't really know if it happened." The man who put the story into the world does not vouch for it. Now, be careful here, because there is a lazy conclusion waiting, and it is wrong. None of that means the trap is fiction. The sabotage program is real and declassified. The dependency the dossier exposed is real and documented. Historians including Mark Trachtenberg have pushed back hard on the skeptics, arguing the corroboration is stronger than the debunkers allow. What collapses under examination is not the operation. It is one spectacular incident inside it. And notice the trick the story plays, because it is the reason it spread so far. The proven half vouches for the unproven half. The dependency was real, so the trap was possible. The trap was possible, so the explosion must have happened. That is not evidence. That is a slope. Which leaves the strangest fact in the whole file. The most famous consequence of the Farewell Dossier may be the one thing in it that never occurred. And the man who made all of it possible never learned either way. By the summer of 1982, he was already in a cell. Here is how the KGB caught the most damaging source in its own technical intelligence directorate. It didn't. In late 1981, the French made a professional decision about Vetrov. He was producing too much, too fast, meeting too often, and every contact was a chance to be seen. So they told him to stop for a while. Go quiet. Stay ordinary. For a running agent, that instruction is worse than danger. The risk was the only thing giving his life shape. He had spent a year as the most important intelligence source in Europe, and now he was a middle-aged colonel with a stalled career, a difficult marriage, and nothing to do but sit at the desk and wait for the French to come back. He drank. On a February night in 1982, he was parked in a car in Moscow with his mistress, and they were arguing, and he had been drinking, and he stabbed her. She survived. A man walking past saw what was happening and came to the window, and in the 2 seconds Vetrov had to decide what that stranger was, 1 year of secret terror answered for him. He did not see a passerby. He saw the KGB. He saw the arrest he had been waiting on since 1981. He stabbed the man repeatedly and killed him. Then he ran. Then he came back, and the militia took him at the scene, with no idea who they had. Consider what almost happened there. He had handed the West 4,000 documents and 250 names, and none of it was in the file that put him in handcuffs. He was arrested for murder. That autumn, a court sentenced him to roughly 12 years, stripped his rank and his awards, and sent him to a labor colony. That should have been the end. A disgraced officer serving a criminal sentence, while in Moscow a mole hunt burned through Directorate T, looking for a traitor, and never once looked at the convict. He could have served his years and stayed alive. He couldn't do it, because for a year he had been the most important man in Europe. And now he was nobody. A drunk who killed a stranger over a woman in a parked car. So he started to talk, in letters, in statements, hints at first, something big before all this, something they don't know about. Somebody in the system read it and pulled the thread. The KGB reopened everything, his effects, his access logs, his travel, his French years, his contacts, and this time they found it. All of it. The counterintelligence service that had failed to detect him for 2 years detected him in prison because he told them. There was a second trial, treason this time. And on the 23rd of January 1985 in Moscow, Vladimir Vetrov was executed by shooting. He was 52. He never learned what any of it was worth. He never knew that his roster emptied Soviet residencies across the Western Alliance, or that France would expel 47 officials in a single day using the list he photographed. He did not know his own service concluded that the heart of Soviet technical collection had crumbled and would not recover. He never knew that his file would become a book, and then a French feature film, and that Emir Kusturica would play a version of him on screen. He certainly never knew that decades after his death, people who had never heard his name would be arguing in public about whether a pipeline in Siberia blew up because of him. He died in a system that had decided he was a traitor, and in the country he was born in, that is still the official view of him. So take what the file actually leaves you with. The documented part is not small, and it does not need the legend. A colonel who could see the whole machine handed the West a complete map of it. The West read Moscow's own shopping list, what it had taken, what it still needed, and who was sent to get it. Officers were named and expelled across multiple countries, and the Soviet Union's most carefully kept structural secret, that a superpower was quietly importing its own future from its enemy, stopped being a suspicion and became a document. That is the transformation at the center of this story. Theft had been a Soviet strength. Farewell converted it into a Soviet exposure, something that could be watched, anticipated, and possibly used. Possibly. That word is where the paper thins. There was a sabotage program. The CIA has published that much. Whether it reached the Urengoy pipeline in the summer of 1982, in the way one official described 22 years later and then declined to stand behind, is not settled and may never be. And there is a last question, quieter than the explosion, that nobody can answer either. A shopping list does not only tell you what your adversary already took, it tells you what he still needs. which means it tells you where he will come back. Whether the West used that only to close doors, or to leave certain doors open on purpose, and for how long, and what was allowed to walk through them and fail years later in a Soviet laboratory, where the failure was blamed on Soviet engineering. That is not in the open record. Vladimir Vetrov opened the door. He was pulled back through it by a fight in a parked car, and he talked himself into the execution chamber, because being nobody was harder than being caught. The codename outlived the man by 40 years, and it is still doing the thing it was chosen to do, pointing at the wrong country and hiding what actually happened.